Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for wanting to learn something new. I appreciate your presence. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I think is so relevant to November and what's going to be happening. With families this month, we're going to be gathering around a table together for the first time in a couple of years. So I think that it is a completely relevant thing to have and to also discuss because it's so much more nuanced than we think it is, right? So, hello, we're going to be talking about family stories, and November is actually Family Stories Month, and I'm going to be talking about how sharing stories can be a protective factor. So hello, everyone. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Ruth. I am a prevention educator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I am the Drug-Free Communities Program Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified in teaching English as a foreign language, leadership skills, and life skills. So thank you so much for being here. And I am excited to see what we can talk about today. So the first things first, I always start my presentations with why this presentation, because there are going to be themes in here, and there are in many themes about talking about substance use and protective factors and, mitigating risk factors. And honestly, it's more about making sure that this presentation is not to scare you. This is to inform you. This is not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. Also, this perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. And as a prevention educator, that's sort of what we do. We attend trainings, we explore the field in which we are experts in, and we look at the evidence and we use it to inform how we can do our presentations, what we can do with them. And to say also, this presentation is evidence informed and some evidence based, meaning that the evidence that we do find and the information that we do gather in this presentation is informed by the empirical evidence presentations and programs that we do at the council. So evidence-based meaning life skills, too good for drugs, parents who host, and things like that. So those are the sorts of programs that I pull from as I make these presentations accessible to all of you. So once again, thank you for being here. And I'm excited to sort of jump into this presentation because it is something that you wouldn't think is so relevant to substance use, and also seeing the accessibility to protective factors that we can explore today. So first thing is Family Stories Month. What is it? Family Stories Month, essentially, I'm going to click it here now, was founded it's a Family Stories Month is in November. And what it says here, basically, from the National Day Calendar, which is a great resource for everyone to look at to just sort of celebrate something, right? It is just in time for the holidays, and it's an excellent time to share stories, learning about family history. And throughout the month, Family History Month encourages you to record and listen to relatives of all ages. You can ask questions, you can ask family members. Also, look at the anecdotal stuff, the traveling, the romance, the adventure of all of your family's past. And also make sure that when you're sharing, there is sort of a humorous way about it so it can be digestible to people that may be uncomfortable with the information that you're sharing. But also, honestly, sharing stories is such a powerful aspect to life that if we share it within our families, then it can be something that can be really interesting and really helpful for us. Also, it says here, essentially, for preparing for sharing and preserving family stories, prepare a list. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Um, uh, Prepare a list of questions, memory prompts to share with family members during family gatherings before family members arrive. Email a list of questions for them to review. Ask family members to write down their memories for a story that they want to share. Individuals can share their memories. And honestly, and I think this is something that we can keep in mind, that when people share stories, it can always be something that someone can remember differently. And that is a point to make throughout this presentation as well. So there are many different ways that you can do that. Also, you can learn how to teach it in the classroom, as well as following any other social medias that you would like around this subject. So I sort of said how we can absorb it, and we're going to be talking about in this presentation specifically why it's important. And the reason why we're going to be talking about why it's important is because without the idea of holding stories to a standard that are worth sharing, we are unable to have really deep and interesting and nuanced and detailed conversations about what our family history is like, but also what our lives are like beyond that. So we're gonna be moving into this as well. So I have shared this slide before. This is part of my Connecting Generations presentation, but this is something that I want to talk about again because one, it is so interesting. Two, it is sort of centered around the idea that family stories are lighthearted and interesting and something that can really help move a conversation forward. But these kinds of conversations, these deep ones, these hard ones, also give gateways to having a wonderful, fulfilling life if we know where we come from. So intergenerational trauma is definitely something that I do want to talk about. Um, Intergenerational trauma essentially is the idea that if one generation has experienced trauma, then the trauma will carry itself through to the other generations after if there is not an attempt to help with that nuance. So, when we are also talking about here is that when we are talking about intergenerational trauma, it is an aspect of ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, which is something that is near and dear to what I teach here, because it is so intrinsic to how we interact with our environment. Trauma can rewrite our brain. Trauma can affect the way that we interact with everyone around us. And without the idea that we are able to address these issues, then people just perpetuate this trauma onto their family and their friends, and especially within generations and beyond with it, the intergenerationalism of it. So we're going to be talking about some references here. And this in particular video is talking about Aboriginals. And because it also is Native American History Month, which is something that I have done a presentation on previously, is understanding that we choose these specific populations because they're the ones that present so prolifically with their intergenerational trauma. And I chose Aboriginals because specifically in Australia, the Aboriginal population were a peoples that were essentially taught to eradicate their culture and to expose them to trauma to sort of make their way as the right way. So they were taught how to sort of strip themselves of their family stories and of their culture, essentially, in order to become whatever people saw them to be or sought them to be after. So I'm going to be playing a video. It is a beautiful hand-drawn video that I think is very well worthwhile. And the YouTube channel that does do it does talk specifically about Aboriginal issues. So if you are more intrigued about this, if you want to learn more, you can obviously visit their YouTube channel, and then they have their website listed.
The story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged.
Oh, my apologies. I think I'm going to start this over just really quickly because I had muted myself.
Story of our communities, people and nation starts a long, long time ago. More than 60,000 years, in fact. This was when our culture and our law first started to thrive. We knew who we were and where we belonged. We took care of each other, our land and our waters. We ate food that made us healthy, lived on country and abided by our laws and song lines. Our families, our children were happy, with strong minds and hearts, because they were where they belonged. But then, everything changed.
Colonization came, bringing wars, disease, famine, violence, and the destruction and violation of our cultural laws, sacred sites, families, and communities.
We were denied our knowledge, language, ceremonies, and identity, the very things that tell us who we are and where we belong. And our connections with each other and the land grew weak.
And then, our children were taken from us. They had their names changed and their identities stripped away. They were told that Aboriginal people were bad. Worse still, they were told that their parents and grandparents did not want them.
For years this happened, and those children became known as the stolen generations.
Our children were denied love and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. This left very deep, very complex, and very real wounds, leaving scars that are still being felt personally, socially, spiritually, and collectively.
In the time when our story started, we were able to parent in the cultural way that has seen our families survive and thrive for generations. Our people were strong, and our culture flowed and healed us in times of hurt.
But since the trauma of colonization and the stolen generations, we have not been able to heal in the same way. And we have unknowingly passed this trauma on to our children through sharing our sad stories and having them witness and experience our pain. This is known as intergenerational trauma, and we see symptoms today in broken relationships, disconnected families, violence, suicide, and drug and alcohol abuse.
But this is not where our story ends. We still have strong minds and hearts, and we still know who we were and where we belong. By creating safe and strong communities together, supporting our families to be free from pain, returning to our culture and building a strength of identity, we can stop the cycle of trauma and bring about positive intergenerational change so that we can continue to thrive for the next 60,000 years. There are simple things that we can all do to help heal our trauma.
Visit healingfoundation.org.au to find out more.
Okay, so I love the visuals of this video for a lot of reasons, but when we're looking at this and when we are sort of analyzing why this happens in the first place, is that sometimes things just happen to those before us and we are the ones after them. So we have to figure out how to pick up the pieces if the trauma wasn't dealt with, right? So when in particular, the narrator had said, we shared our stories of sadness and depression, it was more that sharing stories in their own right is not bad. It's good to know what has happened, but more specifically, sharing stories in a very intentional way to get people to understand your experience and to give them hope in connecting with them, to know that, yes, this happened, but also let's move on. Let's figure out how we can get through this together and become a healthier unit and a healthier family. So I also want to talk about something called the Holodomor. I did not know this existed up until recently. And the reason why I was so flabbergasted about discovering this was because it's not necessarily discussed in the way that I think could be discussed. I know that a lot of people talk about world wars, and that's a really intriguing and interesting topic, especially history buffs, right? But when we are talking about this, I think that if we are looking at the nuances of how people pass on their stories and how people pass on their traumas, the Holodomor is a great example of this. So this particular student, his name was Brent Bezo, and he was a doctoral psychology student at Carleton University in Ottawa. And he he was living in the Ukraine in the mid 2000s, and he was noticing a social hostility and mistrust among the population. And he said it was so subtle that it wasn't necessarily something you'd pick on a short trip there. And when he was talking about this, he had lived there with his wife for a period of time. And what they had found was that there were a lot of references around the area to the Holodomor, especially when I was talking with these people. And essentially what it was the mass starvation of millions of Soviet Ukrainians from the years 1932 only until 1933, but it was considered by many to be a very intentional act of genocide orchestrated by this Joseph Stalin regime. And how we were when I'm looking at this, I wonder how this particular event resonates so much and reaches so far for some of these families that exist in the area. And Bezo had really looked at why this was a particular incident in the first place, or what were the ramifications of this incident in the first place. So he did a qualitative pilot study of 45 people from 3 generations of 15 Ukrainian families, those who had lived through the Holodomor, their children, and then their grandchildren. So it studied 3 generations worth. And basically what they had found was the transgenerational impacts of risky health behaviors, anxiety and shame, food hoarding, overeating, authoritarian parenting styles, high emotional neediness on the part of the parents, and also looking about the mistrust in the community, and which meaning there was low community trust and cohesiveness. So he essentially, and what he had come to the conclusion was that a lot of people were still in survival mode, and each generation seemed to learn from the previous one, with survivors telling children, don't trust others, don't trust the world. And so while they're sort of looking at this, they're looking at the larger quantitative areas here. And the reason why this is so important and why we're discussing this is because it does have ramifications on many generations later. And he essentially what they had found also was that the findings of Bezo, when he had done this qualitative study, was that they're compatible and comparable to many other horrific events that had happened in the past couple of 100 years. So it was very similar to and compatible to the findings of and the intergenerational effects of the Holocaust, the Khmer Rouge killings in Cambodia, the Rwandan genocide, the enslavement of African Americans. And it's not only psychological, but familial, social, cultural, and neurobiological, and possibly even genetic, some of the researchers may say. So what they had found essentially was that they did a transmission and sort of looked at the trauma being the vehicle, like the body is the vehicle for that trauma. And I found that an interesting concept to explore, because they examined the mortality and other Civil War era data on 700 Union Army prisoners of war and 2,500 of their children, along with data on 5,000 non-prisoner of war Union soldiers and 15,000 of their children. Starting from the time the sons of these soldiers turned 45, they found that the sons of Union prisoners of war who had endured particularly harsh conditions while imprisoned died at young ages overall than the sons of prisoners of war who lived in camps under more favorable conditions, and even more so the people who were the sons of non-prisoners of war tend to make out the best in terms of their life expectancy. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean correlation is causation, and that the implication basically needs that there is more exploring to be happening. But when we're looking at this, it's to understand that the intergenerational trauma people experience definitely and holistically affects the way that people interact with their environment later on, especially if that trauma is not dealt with when it happens. So that is definitely a side of family sharing that people can look at, but it is also something to keep in mind as we move forward, but also to keep in mind in general as people do talk about their family stories. So we're going to be moving on from here. So sharing is caring, but can also be preparation. Talking to your loved ones about substance use in the family is something that is so holistically important. I myself have done 2 presentations with the people of the opioid overdose recovery program here at the Mercer Council. And essentially, one of them is how to talk to your children while also having a substance use disorder with the patient navigator here. And also the other one is the recovery experience, and talking about how the recovery experience inherently interacts with the familial ties that people have and the stories that people may want to share. What I found interesting, and the reason why I wanted to look at this study in particular, this one here, is that it talks about drug facts and the genetics behind addiction. And while we're looking through this, the genetics behind addiction is an interesting correlation here. And I wanted to read this cannabis use study because there is a gene linked to cannabis use disorder, and they had found this advanced research when they were exploring other parts. But I want to read through this quickly, was that they had found that it is estimated 30% of marijuana users have a cannabis use disorder, representing problematic use and in some cases addiction. The risk for CUD has a strong genetic component, but it's unclear as to how that's exactly it. They had a genome-wide association study to try to identify genes that might put people at risk for problematic cannabis use. They studied 2,387 cases and 48,985 controls, and found that they replicated their findings in another large group. And I essentially identified a genetic locus on a chromosome that talked about if that gene in particular expressed itself at a lower level than people who had that gene that expressed at a lower level had more likelihood of having a cannabis use disorder. Now, they obviously don't know exactly how to look at this, but they are looking into potential target for future prevention strategies, therapies, and medication. Now, the reason why I wanted to discuss this, and the reason why discussing this is important, is because if you know what is happening in your family, if you know for a fact that substance use disorder runs in your family, if you know for a fact that there are certain chromosomes that people would have, or certain gene types that people would have that are more associated with certain substance use disorders, then sharing that and having that conversation is so key to people having a preventative approach to anything that could potentially turn into a substance use disorder. Now, a lot of people ask, what's the best way to share this? And I think that it depends on the person, it depends on the scenario, it depends on the reality that people have when it comes to interacting with their family and their environments. But these 2 in particular videos that I have shared are both from 2 really well-respected colleagues of mine who have essentially talked about how, addiction and substance use disorder have played a part in how their family functions, but also how to present the information in a way that is non-offensive, digestible, and adds to that conversation. And there are so many ways to do that, but those are the 2 that I can offer to you that we have done programs on. And also, understanding that as a person who shares stories, this can be through the culture of your family, whether it's food, having conversations through food, tradition, a shared activity that is special to the family. I know for a fact my significant other loves fishing with their parents, and that's something that they really appreciate doing. And a lot of those stories that they hear about from family happens to be through those fishing trips. So, and what we can say can be digestible, but also knowing that, are you the best person to tell this story? If it is your experience, if it is something that you want to share, are you the person that can make this happen, that can talk about this experience? Those are the sorts of things that people should be thinking about too. And if you're not the best person to have this conversation, how can you have this conversation, or who can have this conversation with this person? So there are so many ways to do that. And also to make sure that if you are doing that, to make sure that you can get the message across. So we're going to be moving on and moving forward. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, but a lot of the resources that you may want to know about, a lot of the resources that you're interested in or saying, oh, that could be useful, will all be provided in the description on the YouTube channel below. The other thing too is sharing history of substance use disorders and mental health disorders is a huge part of this journey that people have, and family stories can be a part of that too. They can be some things that are fun, they can be some things that are exciting, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something that should be shared, right? And especially even if we're talking about a mental health disorder, my apologies, the lights just went out. If we are talking about a mental health disorder and a substance use disorder, there are many ways that we can sort of talk about it and addressing the elephant in the room without having a holistically hard conversation about it, right? So the first thing is that I have two studies that were presented here. One was the YaleMedicine.org, talks about how parental depression affects children. And I found this fascinating because essentially what they talked about was functioning of child and how parental depression can be diagnosed, how people can help with that mental health disorder, where can they find help? But also they found that signs of depression that are specifically related to parenting can affect the way that a child functions. So lack of responsiveness to a child, inappropriate parenting behavior, such as sharing too much, acting as the child rather than the parent, being intrusive and overly engaged, or detached in a way that can come off as negligent. Also, a child's tardiness or truancy at school can be a part of that as well, because getting out of bed and getting your children to school can be a difficult task when you are struggling with a mental health disorder. Another thing too is that this study in particular essentially says that depression is also in parents is associated with children's poor physical health and well-being. Infants and young children and mothers with depression are more likely to use a variety of acute health care services. The maternal depression symptoms levels are high among caregivers of children with chronic conditions. Depression in parents is associated with maladaptive patterns of healthcare utilization for children. And 1 in 5 children in the United States live with a depressed parent. Depression in parents has been consistently associated with a number of behavior problems and psychopathology in children, including higher rates of depression, earlier age of onset, longer duration, greater functional impairment, higher likelihood of recurrence, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates and levels and of severity of internalizing and externalizing symptoms and disorders in children and adolescents. So that is a lot to say, that if we have things, if we have issues to talk about, if we are looking at the ways in which we can function in a family, we should be getting the help that we need in order to make that happen. So that is something that I hope that everyone could keep in mind as they move forward, especially when they are talking about their mental health disorders and substance use disorders. Now, this is an interesting blog on the Psychology Today, talks about addiction and sharing family history of addiction. And essentially what we are talking about here is that when we are discussing addiction in the family, if we are looking at it in a way that is retrospective, sharing how we felt at that time may be helpful. But this is a great read from someone who has a doctorate in addiction and addiction studies. So we can sort of look at this too. And I wanted to highlight one particular paragraph here. Many of us see our family members struggling with addiction and make the decision to run away as far as we can from that. Others of us, often unconsciously, go down the same path as our loved one by falling into the cycle of addiction. It's hard to say why people choose the path they do. However, research has shown us, genetic and environmental factors, why some may go down one path rather than the other. And one of those protective factors could be actually sharing, hey, addiction does run in our family. Hey, there are, we have an uncle that, comes to Thanksgiving and drinks too much. Those are the sorts of things, and those are the conversations that should be shared, and the family stories that can be shared in a way that is age appropriate and digestible for the people that are receiving that information. So that is one way to look at that. And so it does talk about, choices and things like that. Various research groups. Oh, this was something interesting that I also wanted to share. From a research perspective, it would be naive to deny the association between our family history of alcoholism or drug abuse and our own patterns. Various research groups have studied twins to examine how much of our risk for alcoholism can be attributed to our genes compared to our environment. It's been estimated that approximately 40 to 60% of the risk for developing an alcohol use disorder can be accounted for by genetic factors. It may be even high as 60 to 80% for other substances such as nicotine or cocaine. And the studies are cited right there. So this is the reason why sharing stories and sharing history of family is so important, because it lets people know and get ahead of the curve. It's basically like, all right, I am at risk for alcoholism. Maybe I should avoid having 3 drinks at a party instead of, maybe I should avoid binge drinking. Maybe I should avoid parties altogether. That may be something that's a trigger for me. So having those kinds of conversations and sharing those stories in a way that is digestible and anecdotal helps. And also, a lot of people may want to sort of have this conversation about, all right, well, it's a conversation, it's not a story. But I would say that history and tradition are a huge part of the way that people cope with their realities. And this is one particular story or a video that I wanted to share that talks about the power of stories in family history. And so when we're talking about this too, I do want to say, and I do want to preface with saying, every major event happens with the telling of a story. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. But for now, we're going to be talking about this one particular man who connected with a person who essentially was a very important figure in the Mormon faith. And so I just don't want to give too much away, but we're going to be watching that now.
When he was about 17 years old, he went out hunting with a friend. Well, the unthinkable happened, and he fired a shot, and somehow it accidentally hit his friend, and his friend was killed. Well, as you can imagine, Carl was devastated, to think that you had accidentally shot your dear friend, no intention at all to cause any kind of harm. It would be the furthest thing from your desire. And what made it even worse was that the community started to shun him and to ostracize him. They blamed him for the death. And so this was just an extremely difficult circumstance for a 17-year-old boy to be going through. It got so bad that he started entertaining thoughts of suicide. And so his family, being understandably concerned, said to him, maybe you just need to go someplace and get a fresh start. You're probably not ever going to be able to get past it living in our little community. And so Carl agreed. He felt like that was probably the best thing to do at that point. And so he headed off to America. Can you imagine the courage that took for this young man after he had been through such a devastating experience to leave his family behind, his culture, everything that was familiar to him, and go to a completely new land where he didn't know the people, didn't know the language, had no friends, anything, just a totally new start. But he had the courage to do it. So he got on that boat, came over to America, learned the language. He was a diligent and hard worker, so he got good jobs, started to build a good life for himself. When he was about 30 years old, he happened to read the Book of Mormon. And so he became converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, ended up marrying a wonderful lady. They had 6 kids together. And he became a respected leader in the church and in his community. Well, sorry, shouldn't get emotional here, but this story just touches me. After Mike shared this story with his son, this touched his son in a way that nothing else had. All those encouraging principles of hang on and don't give in to the bullies, those were all fine and well, but when it came right down to it, the thing that touched Mike's son's heart was hearing about a family member who had gone through terrible adversity and had come out triumphant on the other end. And finally, that was the thing that made a difference for Mike's son. So I've been pondering about why stories are so powerful in our lives. And I think one of the big reasons is that we don't experience life in principles. We experience life in stories. Our life is a narrative. And so family stories can help us see our own lives more clearly. They can give us understanding. They can give us perspective. I think that was a big thing for Mike's son. When you think about, okay, my life seems pretty bad with bullies at school or whatever you may be facing, but to hear what Carl had to go through and how he still overcame that, that really would give you some perspective, right? And also, stories give us encouragement and they can give us hope, which can be one of the things that we need most in our lives. I love this quote that I'm going to share from a researcher by the name of Bruce Feiler. He says, from family stories, children, and I would add all the rest of us too, you can be a child or young at heart, children gain insights about insights into how to deal with situations they encounter in life. For example, family narratives might include overcoming adversity, doing what's right, and helping other people in time of need. The healthiest narratives reinforce the sense that family members persevered through many ups and downs as best they could with varying degrees of success. So I love that last statement. Through family stories, we're not trying to paint this idealistic Pollyanna picture that nothing ever goes wrong and chin up, life is good and there's never any trials. But instead, we're sharing stories about, sometimes life gets hard and it doesn't always turn out the way you want.
Okay. So thank you for listening to that. I really wanted to drive that point where when we are talking about families and we're talking about sharing stories, it's more about understanding that other people have gone through this too, that there is an identity that people can claim onto and have that information for, but also understanding that history and tradition is subjective. Anytime someone talks about history, even if we talk about dates and things in a textbook, that is not objective. It is merely saying here are the facts, but there's so much more to that story. Objectivity deals with the idea that it doesn't have one opinion or the other. But when we're talking about history, history is living, history is breathing, history is something that is so nuanced that reporting it in a textbook is only one aspect to understanding that event and that major event in history. Also, major events happen with the telling of a story. We're talking about Rosa Parks being the first person who had been the one to be the major catalyst for the push for civil rights in December 1955. Yes, when the NAACP activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus. These were the things that were important because not a lot of people know that that particular story was something that was crafted and something that was needed by the NAACP. And they knew that that was going to happen. They planted Rosa Parks that day so that she could do what she needed to do. She knew what was going to happen. She knew what she was going to face. And in reality, I think that understanding that it was crafted by the NAACP makes it more impactful. It makes it more real. It makes us understand that the story there is that you need to have a story. You need to have something that relates to that. But also that story fleshes out the event. It fleshes out the idea that Rosa Parks wasn't just someone that sprung to action that day. It was that it was an intentional act and she knew exactly what she was getting into, which makes it all the more powerful because without it, she knew the consequences. She knew what would happen and she still did it anyway. And that's the reason why sharing stories about family is so important because as this video had said, it's that it gives us perspective. It gives us hope. It gives us an idea of connection, and that connection helps us get through the hard things because those hard things that we get through, sometimes knowing that somebody else is going through it or had gone through it and made it to the other side gets us where we need to be. The other thing is that if we're talking about here, this is just mywordcounts.com, 3 reasons why you would want to share stories in general. And I find it fascinating because these 3 reasons are definitely, something that make points here. So we are able to learn hearing stories of friends, family. We can learn from their experiences, good or bad. This type of storytelling can give us amazing insights and experiencing something that we may have never heard about. We can be inspired, opening up to share their people who open up to share their stories can inspire us. We can also form deeper connections because you can say, hey, I never knew that about you. I never knew that that's what you had gone through. I never knew that that was something that you had to face and endure and go through. So that in its own right is something that is so holistically something that is sharing stories with family. It brings people closer. It brings you in. It gives people access to others that you may not have had access to otherwise. So I think that is just such a cool way to look at that. Another thing too is we are going to be moving on to this next section here about sharing at any age. And I think this is so important too, that I have another video, but it's a short one and it just shares a thought here that every age is valid in sharing their experiences, old, young, or in between. It's okay to want to share because there is something that people are valued for. These are things that people should be praised for, that sharing stories in general, sharing an experience is an act of vulnerability. And when we get that validity and that vindication, it helps. But also we're going to be talking about here that sharing a story helps people connect in a way that we may not really think about. So. There we go.
Until the lion tells a tale, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I think about that quote a lot when I visit a bookstore, watch a movie, look at a magazine, or listen to a talk. What I've come to realize is that not everyone's story is told. Throughout history, not everyone has been given a chance to talk about who they are, where they're from, or tell their story. Either from not having economic access, racism, sexism, or class barriers, many people are not heard. Because of this, an incomplete history has been written. Growing up, I was a huge reader, and I don't remember any stories that reflected my life. There weren't any TV shows that looked like me or lived how I lived. If you didn't know any better, you would think that folks like myself didn't exist. When we don't see ourselves in the media, arts, or everyday life, that sends a message that we don't matter. And what we have experienced doesn't matter. Nobel Prize winner and author Toni Morrison once said, if there's a book you want to read but hasn't been written yet, you must write it. So I did what any shy, slightly nerdy kid who wanted to be seen would do. I began writing. When I started writing and talking about who I was, it was so freeing, so powerful. It felt like I climbed to the mountaintop and yelled, "Here I am!" I was putting my flag up and making people aware of my life. I then realized I have to encourage others who are not seen and heard to do so. Representation is powerful. It's incredibly impactful. When you see someone that looks like you, comes from a place like you, and talks like you, that can have a profound effect on you. I remember when I received an email about an essay I wrote from this guy. He said, reading about my experience as a Black man touched him and made him feel seen. My story made him feel validated, like he was not alone. I realized that that was not an isolated incident. From there, I understood the power of sharing my story.
Okay. So I love the idea of looking at something and saying, hey, this has happened. And this is something that people look like me also have experienced. So it's not just the reality of sharing stories within families because it's quote unquote the right thing to do or the way to connect with someone else. It's saying that someone that looks like you, someone that acts like you, someone that, is the older version of you in some ways, can get through this too, can create too, can have stories that are triumphant and interesting and encouraging and hopeful and all those sorts of things. Because if we have the idea that people that look like us go through things like we are, then it gives us the idea that we're not alone. It's the vindication, it's the representation, it's the idea that we, in our own right, can move forward looking like we do and not having to bend to the whim or the sentiment of the world. And I think that is so holistically important. I find it really cool that, there is a power in sharing your story, that people can feel vindicated by it. So we're going to be closing out this presentation here. Thank you for being here. How can we help? Well, the first thing is have tough conversations with your family. Encourage others to do the same. Share all kinds of stories, good ones, bad ones, anything in between. Understand the time in which this person is referring to. People are products of their time. So if they're saying, I had to walk 5 miles to the grocery store, understand that at that time, that is something that it should be valued, should be vindicated, and understanding that some people are products of their time, and the lingo they use, the ideas that they have, those are all based on the environment that they grew up in. Also, be involved in the lives of the children around you, these children in particular that are listening to these stories, that are telling these stories. Deserve to have these stories act as protective factors so that they can move through their lives in a more positive way. Also, never assume you know what people have experienced. Just because people are from a certain age group, they may have had their own experiences presented to them differently, and also experience things differently because of the culture they were part of, because of the age group they grew up in, those sorts of things. Also, and last but not least, especially listen to stories, especially, and be willing to answer and ask questions. If we tell stories, we should be willing to answer questions. If we ask questions, we should be willing to listen to those answers. So as we sort of move through that symbiotic relationship of understanding what that looks like can be such a gift to those people that interact with that. So I always close my presentations on quotes, and I have 2 here. One in particular is from her. I am not going to attempt to pronounce that name, but she is a Nigerian story writer. And essentially what she had said was, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So that's pretty powerful stuff, right? And the next one I have is Lisa Cron, who is the author of Wired for Story, essentially says, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told us what to hang on to. So as we move through our lives, as we look at these different areas of life that do happen, looking at these stories, when we look at these stories and we value them for what they are, that we listen for what they are, we learn and we become excited as to how we can push forward beyond that. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, for your experiences, and for any feedback that you may have. I appreciate you all being here, and I look forward to having you next time. Bye.